Here were two men, as far apart financially, mentally, geographically as two men who can speak the same language and inhabit the same land. One rich, son of an enormously wealthy man, college bred with a high station in the business world. The other, son of poor parents, a ne'er-do-well, uneducated, mentally deficient, an associate of morons like himself, a boy in years without trade or calling, hardly acquainted with the appearance of, say, a $20 bill. Their brief meeting has gifted America with one of the strangest, yet most sensational, criminal investigations we have seen to date.
I'm standing with my husband in his ordeal.
The boy had figured in escapades, but I had never known him to carry any weapon.
Now, is it possible that such a man, who had such a beautiful family...
I am positive he never even carried a knife.
He wouldn't do that without a reason.
I received a postcard from him that said he was well.
and was a pillar in his community.
I want to do everything I can for him.
He proposed to enlist in the Marines.
A former police commissioner.
Next I heard was that my boy was dead.
I have the utmost confidence in him.
And a successful business.
Ward has confessed to killing my boy, and claims to have acted in self-defense.
He was defending himself.
Could be capable of first-degree murder.
He's
He is
innocent.
innocent.
Mr. Mills, how does your client plead?
Not guilty.
Calling the case of the people of the state of New York versus Walter Ward.
Well, my boy, who was aged 19 years, left our home on April 25th. When he was away for 2 days, I came to the conclusion that he had changed his mind and gone elsewhere to seek work. It was just a week later that I received a postcard from him dated at Paris Island, and he said he was well and that he had enlisted with the Marines, but was uncertain about whether he could pass the physical examination. We did not hear from him again until Thursday, when the police notified us that he had been found dead in New York with a bullet wound in his breast. I'm at a loss to understand how he even got down to Paris Island, let alone New York, as when I last saw him, he had less than $1 change in his pockets.
The mystery about the death of my nephew, who had not been home for over a month, is that his government discharge papers were missing. His mother had received a letter from him, which was written from the Paris Island Navy barracks. He said he was going to re-enlist, but he told her not to write him to that address as he might not be there.
The story about his being involved in a blackmailing plot does not sound reasonable to me. As far as I've been able to find out, no weapon was found near his body when it was discovered, and there was no sign of any struggle near where the body was found. All we know about the case is what we have learned from the newspapers, but there are too many loopholes in the stories that I've been told. I personally doubt these statements made by Mr. Ward.
I just returned from White Plains, where I identified the body and visited the scene of the shooting, and there wasn't any trace of blood at the spot where the body was found. I had a long talk with the sheriff and the coroner. Sheriff Warner told me several theories about the killing of my nephew, but nothing about any blackmailing plot. I was also told by Coroner Fitzgerald that my nephew was evidently shot from the left side, the bullet going almost through the body to the right side. He also told me that the course of the bullet was peculiar.
The entry point of the bullet was in the center of the chest, and it appeared to have exited 2 inches lower on the back.
Through this dark and stormy night, faith beholds a feeble light upon the blackness streaking, knowing God's own time is best. In a patient hope I rest for the full day breaking. This is a verse by the great American poet John Greenleaf Whittier, who was born and spent most of his life in Haverhill, Massachusetts, where I have always lived, and where my boy was raised. Well, it best expresses my feelings today. If a poor man had confessed to taking another's life, he would have been executed by now. Yet Walter Ward walks freely through the streets of New York. Ward must be brought into court to answer for his crimes, and when he is brought to judgment before 12 men to answer for his shameful killing of Clarence, then I will know the full day breaking.
I saw the two of them together at Quincy Staples many times. They used to play poker together, too. He was at Ward's house the night he died.
That boy came in here about a month ago. He hopped a Ford Bacon Company truck and asked to repair his trouser leg.
In late April, he came in and wanted to hire a rig. I asked where he wanted to go. He said he just wanted to drive around. He had two well
He said he had plenty of money and he showed me a roll. I didn't trust him, so they all left.
To tell you frankly, I did not like Mr. Peters, but I never did him a wrong turn. I was sore at him when he worked during the strike because I am a
I never
union
thought
man.
much of him until I saw him hanging with a fellow who was a young millionaire.
He was just sort of a boy around the street. Whenever he wasn't working, Clarence Peters just sort of loafed around. He never seemed to travel in elegant.
I heard he had been working for Ward for years, in secret of course. He couldn't tell his family where all his money came from.
Clarence Peters, 19. Dishonorably discharged from the Navy some months before, was weary of the humdrum life of his native town of Haverhill, Massachusetts. He was one of many children in a poverty-stricken family, and he longed for the world of adventure as a somewhat feeble imagination painted it. With sudden decision, knowing he was ineligible for the Navy, he thought he might sneak into the Marines. So he applied, saying nothing about his dishonorable discharge. He was shipped out to the station at Paris Island, but training stations have a knack for figuring these things out. Peters had been uncovered as an untrustworthy gob, and his application was rejected. He was told to get ready to return north, and on May 14, he was given transportation to Philadelphia. His travels from Philadelphia, he was told, must depend upon himself. So, in the ragged clothes he had come in, but a little more ragged than before, with $1.50 in cash, a soiled deck of cards in his pocket, and some grub in a cardboard box, Clarence Peters left Paris Island. His train reached Philadelphia on 1:20 on the afternoon of May 15. We know nothing else about the action of Clarence Peters between the time of his arrival in New York at 5 that evening and the time his body was found at the Conseco Reservoir the next morning at 7:30. In the tale that has been spun by Ward, he claims that Peters had been blackmailing him for weeks. Obviously, this cannot be true. From the passenger records in Philadelphia and New York, it is clear that Peters could not have possibly been in the state of New York until, at most, 18 hours before he was killed. And if the blackmail had, in fact, been going on for weeks, as Ward states, then there was no way Peter had any involvement in the crime. Blackmail couldn't have been the reason for Ward's cold-blooded and deliberate decision to murder Clarence Peters.
About 5 or 6 weeks before the murder, I was summoned to Ward's home. His wife begged me to come over and treat him. When I arrived, I found him writhing on the floor with an empty bottle of poison beside him. Now, it is my personal opinion that it was accidental. I don't believe that it was suicidal at all. Mr. Ward is subject to very severe headaches, and it is an easy thing to get medicines mixed in the dark.
I was eating in a small lunchroom 3 doors down the street from the Hotel Martinique. I overheard a conversation between 5 men talking about Henry Ford's cars, which then switched to a man named Ward. One of the men, who was younger, then said, "I'm going to get Ward and get him right." They all left shortly after, and I do not know where they went.
I know nothing about the case. I didn't know anything about the case until I read about it in the paper. Not to say that Walter's uncommunicative. Yes, he's my brother, but he's in New Rochelle and I'm in the city. And I know nothing about this conspiracy about our father. He didn't leave town to avoid appearing in court. He is in Michigan on business. I don't know when he will return. I took myself out of the bakery a long time ago.
Our father told me the whole story after the shooting, after Walter already turned himself in. None of us knew about it before it happened. It makes sense, though. He was acting strange just before the shooting. He wasn't really tending to the business. Walter told me he needed to borrow around $30,000 in company stock. Soon after that, he told me he might need $100,000 more. I told Walter we had to ask Dad, and Walter said, "Tell him I've got to have it." When we talked to our father, he told us to wait until he came back from his trip.
That night my husband called me and told me he wouldn't be home for dinner. He said it was a business engagement. I asked him what I should do when our guests arrived that evening. He had invited some friends over to play cards. He told me to play and he would join us when he was able to get home. And so we played, but he never showed. He got back early the next morning. He was frazzled, sweating. When I think about what he went through that night, thank God he was able to get one of them. But now my family lives in fear. I fear for my husband, my children, myself. I can never rest in peace as long as those rats are still alive.
Now, it is important to differentiate what is fact and what is fiction. Now, allow me to remind you of the true details of my client's story. Details that have been exaggerated and twisted by the newspapers and the prosecutors. 3 days after the body of Clarence Peters was found, one of the attorneys of the Ward family, the office of Westchester County, announced that he was ready to surrender the man who had shot Peters, and that man was Walter Ward of New Rochelle. He's the son of George Ward, the vice president of the Ward Baking Company, the assets which are rated at more than $40 million. He was, by political appointment, the chairman of the Board of Commissioners, and at that time he turned himself in. Now, there was not even the least bit of suspicion against Ward until this very day in court. There has never been a revealed fact that would have created suspicion against him if he had not turned himself in. It was then arranged that he should be physically surrendered on May the 22nd. Now, Ward and his attorneys then filed a written statement giving the leading facts of the tragedy. Those were in brief. Now, Mr. Ward for some time had been blackmailed by 2 men known as Charlie Ross and Jack Rogers. They had been threatened to reveal certain alleged scandals affecting the Ward family unless they had been paid $30,000. Now, Mr. Ward fulfilled this request by borrowing money from his father's business. Shortly after, Ross and Rogers came back into contact with him, demanding more money up to $75,000. Now, in this case, if the needs were not met, the blackmailers would reveal the secrets of the Ward family and physically harm members of Ward's family. Now, Mr. Ward met them on the night of May 15th for the purpose of, well, convincing him of his inability to further satisfy their needs. Clarence Peters, the dead boy, a stranger to Mr. Ward, had been placed in Ward's car with him. Peters held a revolver to Mr. Ward and told him to drive to a lonely spot a little way north up of the Conseco Reservoir. The other blackmailers followed Peters and Ward in their car. Now, upon arriving at the scene, Peters ordered him a light, and the other 2 blackmailers had parked. Now, Ward, being convinced that his life was in danger, then grabbed Peters' hand with the revolver as Peters was descending from the vehicle. Peters' revolver was discharged, the bullet missing Ward. Now, Ward used his left hand to seize Peters' revolver and then pulled out his own gun. Now, he instantly fired back at Peters, who staggered back and fell by the roadside. The 2 blackmailers in their car had at once stopped, opened fire upon Ward, whereupon they fled in the car. Now, every decision following the pull of that trigger on May 16th, 1922, until this very day, in court has been made by Ward and Ward alone, to protect his family from the blackmailers, the media, and the people who claim the Ward family have hidden histories of violent tendencies and, well, despicable acts.
A medium called Van Burr was brought into the Foxhall murder case in England. While in a trance, he was handed wearing apparel of the dead man, and in a few moments he saw the victim's body floating among the lilies in the water. He gave such an adequate description of the place that the body was quickly identified. Friends hurried to the water, and sure enough, there was the body of the missing man. I am positively certain that in many mysteries of this kind, a psychic working from a spiritualistic trance has reconstructed the picture of the tragedy and has been able to put the police in the way of solving it. I am certain that a medium could tell how and when and under exactly what conditions Peters met his death. Now, the psychic would have to be a friendly one to the side of Peters, as heaven does not like a board of inquiry.
How would Holmes go about solving it?
Well, that's a bit too difficult. I have not studied the Ward case from a Sherlock Holmes point of view, as I have not had time. I should like to, however, because it would be an ideal Sherlock mystery. But I am of the impression he would confine his attention to the Ward family alone, leaving the actual murder to unravel itself after the blackmailing plot was solved.
You think it was blackmail that caused the shooting?
Sherlock Holmes always took facts given him and proved them false before dropping them.
He hadn't reported to the police station at all in April. He had left town before with short notice, but he had been gone for a couple of weeks this time. and he left no clue to where he would have gone. I was called in by Chief Cody to go find Ward, and I had, let's say, a hunch that he was at the Bowie racetrack near Baltimore. And there in the betting ring, I saw Ward, pissed drunk, laying bets of over $100, throwing bills down like confetti. I approached him and I said, "All right, Walter, it's time to get home. Your wife is worried about you." And he brushed me off. He wouldn't go. So the next day I came back to the track thinking he could have spent another day there, and he was nowhere to be found. So I called Chief Cody and he said, "Don't worry. His brother scooped him up in Washington and is bringing him home."
To the Westchester Police Force. I won't give my name, as I don't want my husband to know where I was on the evening of May 15th, but I find it to be my civic duty to tell my account of the Ward Peters case to the authorities. On the evening of May 15th, I went for a ride with a man who was not my husband. We had stopped the car on King Street and shut off the lights so that we wouldn't be seen, and while we were in the auto, we heard another car approach, and we carefully watched as it stopped just behind our vehicle. Whoever was in the car threw the body of another man out and departed in the direction whence it came. It is my opinion that we were parked near the spot where Clarence Peters was found and that the body was put there by Walter Ward.
My motor truck stalled at 10 on the night of May 15th. I was on a trip from Connecticut to Brooklyn with my son and a coworker when my car stalled near the bridge on a road near White Plains. It was nearly noon the next day before we could resume our journey. We were stuck there all night within half a mile of the spot where the body was found. I never heard or saw anything that would even suggest a shootout. Very few cars drove by us and I didn't hear any gunshots or anything.
I met Walter Ward years ago in Pittsburgh. I was at a Pittsburgh Rebels game, as my father used to be a ball player on that time. My friend Peggy introduced me to Ward, who was the secretary for the baseball club at the time. Peggy told me he was a big spender who could throw a good party, so she introduced me to him. Then he invited us to a party later that night at the apartment he was staying in. Both of us went, and then he made advances towards me. I refused him as I was already seeing someone. He got aggressive and I left. Later that night, I was getting ready for bed when the door to my apartment burst open. 2 men filed in, followed by Ward, and they started to grab me and pull me out into the hallway. I fought as hard as I could. Thank God, Peggy was there too. She burst out of the bathroom and threatened to call the police, and all 3 of them left. My attorney called Ward, threatening to sue him. His father bought our silence for $10 grand and then relieved him of his secretary position. By the time this even reached the news, Ward had already told reporters he was being blackmailed. He always cries blackmail when he's in trouble.
Is the prosecution ready with its case?
Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to return to Ward's account of the murder. According to his story, Peters exited the passenger side of Ward's Astut's car and stepped onto the running board on the driver's side. Mr. Mills, would you come up here for a moment?
Might I ask why?
I'd very much like to present a reenactment of the killing based on the story of the defendant. Now, Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibits 1 and 2 to the jury. This is the .38 automatic pistol that Ward claims he used to shoot Peters. And this other gun is the .32 revolver that Ward claims Peters was using. Now, in this reenactment, I will portray Walter Ward and Mr. Mills will portray Clarence Peters. Mr. Mills, would you take this and aim it at me on your right hand? And don't worry, they aren't loaded. Now, after Peters stepped onto the running board, Ward grabbed Peters' gun-wielding arm and deflected his aim into the air. Then the left-handed Ward aimed the gun to Peters' heart and shot. Thank you, Mr. Mills. You may be seated. Now, anyone who understands the anatomy of an automatic pistol knows that shots from close range expel powder. Your Honor, I would like to present Exhibit 3 to the jury. I have here the vest that Peters was wearing when he was found in the morning of May 16. Upon further examination of Peters' clothing, you can't find any signs of powder burns anywhere. And according to the coroner's report, which is Exhibit 4, there were no signs of powder burns on Peters' skin either. More curiosity lies in the fact that Ward was in possession of not only the gun that he used, but the gun that Peters allegedly used. Ward's first statement has no trace of him grabbing the gun, but that he returned to the scene to seize Peters' gun. If Peters is a villain in this scenario, why would Ward return to take his gun? Why wouldn't he leave it to further implicate Peters as a villain? Exhibit 5. I have here a picture of Clarence Peters laid out with his arms by his side at the crime scene. Now, if Peters truly did have a bullet in his heart, and he fell off the running board, stumbling in the sand before he fell, as Ward states, the likelihood that he would have fallen this neatly is very slim. He would have more than likely have stumbled over in a heap rather than fallen as if laid out for a funeral, complete with his cap pulled over his eyes. I'd like to return to Exhibits 3 and 4 for a moment. According to the coroner's report, Peters was shot through the heart with an exit wound 2 inches lower on his back. And according to the report, his shirt also has a hole on the front and back of his shirt, on both sides. And in the vest you can see where the bullet exited, but no place where it actually entered. How could that be, that the bullet completely penetrated the shirt, while completely missing the vest he wore over it? Peters' vest was completely buttoned when he was found. The only possibility was that Peters was shot with an open vest and that the vest was somehow buttoned back up before the body was found. Now, I'd like to return to Ward's account that many shots were fired between Ward and Peters' alleged blackmail team. Yet, only one shell was found at the scene of the crime. How can that be, with all of the commotion that Ward states occurred? It is absolutely clear that the murder could not have happened as Ward said it did. The murder did not occur on the Conseco Reservoir, but at an undisclosed location in which Peters found himself with an open vest. Ward then shot Peters without the company of Ross or Rogers, and overcome with guilt, traveled to the Conseco Reservoir and properly laid out the body of Peters before fleeing the scene like a coward. Then Ward, who believed he couldn't get away with such a despicable crime, approached someone and asked for as much assistance as they could muster up in a 3-day span. This assistant then helped Ward fabricate his blackmail story involving Peters, and when the whereabouts of the gun were inquired, Ward conveniently produced a second gun, one he would have had access to as the police commissioner.
A busboy named Christopher Ryan from a Manhattan restaurant reported to us last night that a young and stylishly dressed woman, after eating at the restaurant every day for a week, approached him and said,
I have a job I want done. There's $500 in it for any man who has the nerve to carry it out.
I've got the nerve. What's the job?
There's a guy in New Rothschild I want.
Want? Want how?
Dead. I'll bring you to his house. You shoot him and the $500 is yours.
The boy was obviously very frightened by this request, but he bravely tried to obtain more information from her.
Who's the guy?
Ward. Walter Ward.
A name he recognized.
That's the guy who killed the Peters boy, isn't it?
You'd think so. He's not the one, though. We need to kill somebody else in his house.
Oh?
Ward is innocent. He didn't shoot the sailor. He confessed to the shooting so he could shield the true slayer. I know how to get him out of the trouble he's in, but we need to get into the house first.
She showed him a revolver and a roll of bills. The boy quickly devised a plan to get the authorities involved without tipping off the woman.
I need to think it over. The restaurant closes at midnight. Come back then and we can talk it over.
The woman agreed. The boy went to his manager, who granted him to leave and talk to the police. We hid near the restaurant that night, and the boy waited outside for the woman to appear. She never did. We are hard at work trying to find this woman and bring her into custody.
We cannot convict the man if he is lying, but he is on trial for first-degree murder. As of now, he pleads on the ground of self-defense, that he was being blackmailed. Of course, any evidence of the blackmail has yet to be presented. His siblings each say they knew nothing of the blackmail until Ward surrendered himself, but there is one woman who may know more details of the blackmail that have not been shared. Your Honor, I am forced to call Miss Beryl Ward to the stand.
Do you swear by the Almighty God that the testimony you shall give will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say, I do.
I do.
Please be seated.
Where do you reside?
63 Decatur Street, New Rochelle.
Sutton Manor.
Yes, sir.
Are you the wife of Walter Ward?
Yes, sir.
And prior to the morning of May 16, had your husband ever mentioned anything about the case under now which he's being tried?
No.
And prior to this trouble, did you know anything about your husband's relationship to the deceased?
I did not.
Had he ever mentioned the names Clarence Peters, Charlie Ross, or Jack Rogers to you?
No, he didn't.
You had never seen this man before.
No,
And Ward never mentioned anything about this man to you before he was found dead.
never.
Were you on friendly relations with your husband?
Of course.
Then is he usually this uncommunicative?
I didn't see him much around this time. He was at work very often, very busy.
Would you say he worked so often to support his family?
Yes, of course.
Has your husband been separated from you and your family for an extended period of time?
Just when I took our children to Canada 2 summers ago, we spent some time with my family, but business required my husband to stay in New York.
Business matters was his reasoning.
Yes.
Mrs. Ward, was your husband summoned to the draft in 1917?
Yes, but he was exempt.
And why is that?
We depended on his salary, my children and I. If he was drafted, we wouldn't have been able to survive.
You depended on his salary.
Yes.
Were you or your husband barred access from either of your family's respective fortunes?
We are not a family that asks for favors from our parents.
Dependence in your union is important to you.
Yes.
I understand. Mrs. Ward, were you home at the time of your husband's return home of the morning of May 16?
Yes, sir.
And what time did your husband come home that morning?
He came home between 4 and 5 o'clock. He came into our bedroom, which woke me up.
And that night, when your husband came home, as you have told us, did he give you any explanation as to why he was out so late?
He did.
And was it satisfactory to you?
It was.
And what did he say to you?
Objection argumentative.
Sustained.
And then what happened?
He went to work, as he always does. He wanted to continue his work.
Did you know of a frequent brunette visitor at the Ward Baking Company, a non-employee, the week prior to Peters' murder?
Yes, the newspapers claimed it was some other woman, but I am certain it was his sister, Garnett.
Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit 6. This is the testimony of Guy Phillips made mere weeks after the deceased was discovered. He claims he encountered Peters on the evening of May 15, who begged him for help, claiming he was, quote, in a fix with a married man about a girl. Now, were you aware of this?
I stick by my husband's story. He is telling the honest truth. I have the utmost confidence in him. My husband's innocent. I can assure you there is no other woman involved in this case.
So there is no additional information on the blackmail you are willing to provide?
No.
No further questions.
Does the defense have any questions?
No, Your Honor.
The witness is excused.
I'd now like to call Mrs. Inez Peters to the stand.
Do you swear by the Almighty God that the testimony you shall give will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say, I do.
I do.
Please be seated.
Where do you reside?
19 Grove Street, Haverhill, Massachusetts.
Are you the mother of the deceased Clarence Peters?
Yes, sir.
And your children have all been born and raised in Haverhill?
Yes, sir.
How old was your son when he died?
19.
Did you see him often?
Yes, sir. He rarely worked, so he was usually home. In the times that he did work, the largest sum he ever made was about $20 a week, and all of which he gave to me.
And why is that?
Well, we didn't have much money. We still don't. But Clarence always helped out with house expenses whenever he could.
Are you certain you've never heard the names Charlie Ross, Jack Rogers, or Walter Ward before his death?
Yes.
And your son never mentioned anything about having a wealthy friend in New York?
No.
You say your son left on the day of April 25, 1922, to search for a job. Is that correct?
Yes.
Was he acting strange or malicious?
No.
Mrs. Peters, did he tell you that he would be leaving the state to find work?
No.
Did he say anything to you before he left?
I had seen him earlier that day at noon. We met downtown, and Clarence said he was having trouble finding a job, that he was unsuccessful, but he would be going to Groveland to keep searching. But instead, he came home. He said he had talked to Jack Smith about working at his restaurant, but he couldn't start until next week. I got frustrated. He'd been putting this off for so long, I yelled at him. I said, "Don't you darken my door until you've got a job." And then he left. We needed the money, we had to eat, but I didn't mean to be so cruel. I got upset. I didn't think it would be the last time that I saw him.
One last question, Mrs. Peters. Was your son violent?
No, sir.
Thank you, Mrs. Peters. Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Does the defense have any questions?
Yes, Your Honor. Mrs. Peters, do you or your husband work?
My husband does. He's a gas fitter. He does the occasional work with the fire department, too.
You're a housewife, then?
Yes, sir.
Do any of your children work?
My son Leslie's the only one old enough now. There isn't much work available in the area, but Les works at one of the shoe factories when he can. He helps with expenses.
You told Attorney General Sherman that you live on 19 Grove Street in Haverhill, Massachusetts, correct?
Yes, sir.
Well, the newspaper account states that you live in the basement of a 3-story house. Is this the same house you live in now?
Yes, sir.
And you live here with your husband and your children?
Yes, sir.
Doesn't that get a little cramped?
Objection. Badgering.
Overruled.
We have 5 children to feed as well as ourselves. We don't have the financial means for anything better.
Oh, but you have the means to travel to New York and back multiple times a year.
We have friends that help us pay the fare. My brother helps too.
Mrs. Peters, if you can't afford travel fare, how are you able to pay for your lawyers?
My brother-in-law was a lawyer. He ran a prominent firm in Haverhill. His business partner, Fred Magnuson, our very good friend, agreed to help us.
And he's doing this for free?
No, sir, but he's been very accommodating.
I see. Mrs. Peters, was your son ever known to have a connection to New York?
The only time I'd ever known him to be in New York was about 5 years ago when he was on his way home from Hampton Roads.
And what business did he have there?
He was visiting a relative.
Your son been known to, well, frequent any racetrack?
No, sir.
Was he violent?
No, he was very peaceful.
Was he attracted to firearms?
I've never known him to carry any firearms, any weapon at all, really. He never even carried a knife.
Had he ever engaged in illegal activities?
Well, Clarence.
Mrs. Peters, had your son ever engaged in illegal activities?
Yes. The boy had gotten into some trouble. He had scrapes with the law and was arrested a few times, but he never meant any harm. He wasn't weak-willed, but he was easily led. He never drank or gambled. He got into trouble because he indulged in boyish pranks.
So you're aware of the automobile he's supposed to have stolen in November 1921?
Yes, but that was only a joyride. He rode in it and then he left it.
Well, what about the reports of a watch?
It was a girl's watch. A girl named Queenie gave that to him. I don't think she stole it.
Was this girl named Queenie Jones?
Yes, sir. Her married name is Elliot.
Yes. And I'm sure that you're aware that she and her family were previous residents of Haverhill.
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, I present my first exhibit, the testimony of Miss Queenie Jones Elliot. It says she's now a resident of England where her family's from. She stated that she knew your son very well. She did mention that he scared her at times with violent outbursts. Were you aware of this?
No, sir.
And Mrs. Elliot does not seem to recall ever giving a watch to your son. Well, when we met with her, we presented it, and she claimed it, well, just disappeared a month before your son left town.
I'm sorry,
Mrs. Peters, you have made it clear that you know your son had an extensive history of theft. The next visit I have here is, his criminal record, which I obtained from the Haverhill Police Department. It lists here he'd been arrested, 5 times. Twice at the age of 15, once at the age of 16, and twice more at the age of 18, in addition to a dishonorable discharge from the Navy, all on grounds of theft.
Well, yes.
And while in the Navy, he learned how to use a gun, which probably encouraged more criminal behavior. Behavior which, probably started from a young age when his parents were so desperate for money
No, stop.
that they needed to send their own child to get things for them. Or maybe your poverty-stricken lives are just a desperate charade to gain sympathy for a vile murderer.
Don't you
Objection!
dare villainize us! Mr. Mills, my family and I are not malicious people. We are merely here because we want justice, not vengeance. I don't want to see Walter Ward convicted if he's innocent, but he has admitted to killing my son. He claims my son was a blackmailer, but I'm here to tell you that that is an impossible claim. My son was a good boy. In his heart, he really was. He looked out for me whenever he could. Our lives have been full of misfortune. I have had 10 children. Only 5 of them are alive. My husband is a sickly man who struggles to find work, and many a time I have wondered where the food was coming from to keep my family from starving. Clarence quit school when he was hardly 14 so that he could go to work and help us. He gave me nearly every penny he ever earned, and whenever things were bad and I was downhearted, Clarence would recite poetry to me. He frequently attended reformatories. Yes, he made mistakes, but he tried to get better. He was just a boy. We couldn't pay for material things, so he felt that there was some need to take them. How else would he have gotten them? He He felt stuck like he had no other option, and no matter how many times we tried to get him to stop, he couldn't. But my son would never have hurt anyone. He was a good boy.
No further questions.
The witness is excused.
Your Honor, the people rest their case.
I knew Clarence and Haverhill. They were very close. He actually wanted to marry me. My divorce wasn't finalized yet, so I wouldn't appease him. He came to me one day and said he couldn't find any work in Haverhill and asked me to lend him some money so that he could go to Paris Island. I lent him $7 so he could go. He said he wasn't sure he could get work in the Marines and that if he was unsuccessful he would return to Haverhill. He promised me that someday he would be rich enough to win me over. I wish he understood that was never the issue. He went to Paris Island and was murdered on the way back. I was deeply saddened by his death. Within 2 weeks, one of Ward's attorneys paid us a visit in Haverhill. They offered to pay for a trip to New York, which we accepted. My family and I visited the offices of his attorneys. They asked me,
Was Clarence Peters a degenerate?
I said no, and they said,
Yes, he was.
eventually, they got me to say that he was a blackmailer. They told me to say that Clarence had received a letter in the care of White Plains Post Office telling of a certain millionaire who had paid to keep something quiet. They kept after me until I said what they had told me to, and then they made me sign a statement. But none of it's true. I knew it wasn't at the time, but they persuaded us with the opportunity to go back home to England. I know now that their intention wasn't to exchange favors. It was to force me to make a false testimony and then whisk me overseas so I couldn't testify. Clarence was not a blackmailer. He never knew Ward. He wasn't a criminal. He was just a weak, unfortunate...
Is the defense ready with its case?
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mrs. Peters just said before all of you today that her son was never known to own a firearm. Now, what evidence have we got that Peters did not carry a gun? Do you suppose he would let his mother know that he had a gun if he had one? Now, Mrs. Peters claims that he was, well, unfamiliar with firearms. Well, surely this is untrue. He'd been in the Naval Service of the United States for 2 months in 1919. What do they use in naval service? Clothespins for weapons? Do you tell me that this young man did not know how to use a common revolver? Now, it is mighty lucky for Walter Ward that he did not know how to use it better. Mighty lucky. See, if he'd known how to use it better, Walter Ward would not be here. Now, in Mr. Ward's statement, he says he's being blackmailed. He met with names Charlie Ross and Jack Rogers, and the unknown boy, later identified as the deceased. Now, we know from his paper trail and from several witnesses, from his hometown and in Paris Island, that Peters was not in New York any longer than 18 hours before he was found. Peters was desperate to get home, as the Marine Corps Recruitment Center would not furnish his travelings home. He resorted to looking for an odd job, and he was offered one, to help aid in a blackmail plot. Now, Peters was not unfamiliar with crime. He decided a few, well, paltry dollars to help him travel home would justify his violent actions towards a stranger, so he gladly agreed to help Ross and Rogers. Now, the probabilities are that if he was employed by the blackmailers to act as their gunman, and this hire did not happen to possess a firearm, then he would furnish him with a gun. Now, I would like to refocus on the crime scene photograph, the one of Peters lying on the street. I would like to mention that the body was found by 2 men. Now, upon discovering a body, some citizens may be led to believe that the deceased person is sleeping or slumped. They could have manipulated the body, with no malintent, of course. but they intended to shake it, awake, or try to carry it again, with no intention of tampering with the crime scene. Now, by the time police appeared, well, they need to photograph the scene. Body need to be placed where it was found. Now, you must believe that in finding a body, you may not remember every detail of how it was found. Maybe you were more focused on making the body look, well, presentable for a last photograph. Now, these men were given the job of resetting the scene, the results of his body being perfectly laid out. Now, I know the detectives of this case tried very diligently to prove ownership of the guns that were presented previously. Well, the ownership could not be proven. That is true, which aids Sherman's hypothesis that both the guns belonged to Ward. Now, since it is strange to have returned to the scene to retrieve it, that is something significant. If Ward was concocting a story, he would have left the gun by Peters' hand. In the inference of suicide, well, it would have been valid. Now, taking the gun away from him, of course, prevented that. He probably had no intention of taking the gun at all. In his excitement, he drove a full mile, as he estimates, up the road. Now, wouldn't you be excited? Wouldn't any decent man, if the conviction came upon you, even in necessity, that you had taken a human life? Wouldn't you be horror-stricken? Now, after regaining control of himself, mastering his nerves, he turns around, he comes back to the scene, and the thought comes to him and he stops. He picks up the revolver on the ground. There was no purpose to conceal it. Well, the good sheriff testified that on the 19th of May, the first day, Ward's attorneys told him that they had Peters' gun, and they'd give it to him if he wished it. And he said he would like it. So it was turned over. Now, I would like to refocus on the vest, which has been so exhaustively fixated on during this entire investigation. Now, the vest claimed to have been buttoned up completely when Peters was found. That is a fact. It was buttoned up as it could have been. Now, if you look at the vest, you will see the bottoms at the top and the bottom had been buttoned up. They're missing. Those who found it must have assumed it was buttoned up entirely. Because the body lay relaxed in death, it appeared to be closed over. Now, no witness meant to testify falsely that the first buttonhole had a button in it. And he did not mean to do that. But as he looked down upon it, well, it laid closed. The body was not in action. Now, if the body be in action, the man struggling for his life, well, where was his vest? Flung open. Now, as you can see, as I unbutton my own vest, pull it open, my heart is completely exposed. Now, the vest was never closed enough during the shootout to warrant a bullet hole. Now, another thing Sherman pointed out is the fact that there was only one shell found at the scene. First off, it should have been noted that Ross and Rogers were shooting from inside the car. Now, I do not know the natures of the revolvers that were used by these men, but if the guns were automatic, then any shell found from their gun would have been injected inside the car, not on the road. Now, the .38 caliber automatic shells found at the scene would have come from Ward's gun. Now, the shell of the cartridge fired by Peters, of course, remained in the revolver. Now, there is no dispute about that. Now, it was in the revolver that was handed over to the attorneys of Mr. Ward and to the sheriff. Now, I would like to close my presentation by reminding the jury exactly what happened in the eyes of Walter Ward that evening. 3 men held him at gunpoint and forced him to a remote location. There were men who threatened him and the lives of his family. He saw no other respectable way out of the situation than to fire back in self-defense. Not even the highly respectable Ward family could remain calm in a situation where the lives were as high as their children. The defense rests.
If they had listened to me, Ward would have been fried by now. I tried to tell him. I did. It happened in the library, in the house. Ward was in trouble. They almost figured him out. It was all his idea, and Daddy wouldn't play along. So they convened. We met. They needed an alternative, and the boy was scared. He wanted out, but he knew too much. Shot him right there. I know, I saw it. And the police find nothing in the house. How could they have missed it? That boy didn't have to die. He didn't deserve to be thrown onto the dirt road like a rag doll. He didn't mean to get involved in any of this. He didn't want to play anymore. Don't listen to Ward. He shot Peters. He wasn't trying to defend himself. He was trying to defend himself. He was trying to protect his charade. Why won't anyone listen to me? He's guilty. He's guilty of sin.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the fate of this case now rests upon you. Taking into account the testimonies and the arguments you have heard here today, it is up to you to decide if Walter Ward is guilty of the crime he has been charged with. After hearing these closing arguments, please retire to the jury room to determine how you collectively believe this case should be handled. This decision must be unanimous. You will be given proper time to think on the facts of this case. On behalf of the state of New York, I thank you for your time. Mr. Sherman, Mr. Mills, are you ready with your final arguments?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
A man is, of course, presumed innocent until proven guilty. But if by statement or confession a man says he killed another in self-defense, and it is demonstrated that part of that statement is false, the jury must cast out the untruths and judge on the facts that remain of the confession. And many questions remain. Why would two blackmailers who are expecting to get $75,000 out of Ward and who were themselves armed hire a gunman? Why should they hire someone in order to share with him part of this fine melon of $75,000? And where is the proof of this blackmail? He says he gave the gang $30,000 and that $75,000 more had been demanded of him. But the only evidence that we have that he was blackmailed is in his own statement. Alexander Hamilton was blackmailed. So was George Washington. But where is the evidence of the Walter Ward blackmail? Who's to say he was even being blackmailed at all? Who's to say that he wasn't part of a larger scheme to solicit more money from the Ward fortune, from his father? Ward didn't swear out a warrant for the arrest of the blackmailers. Why? His lawyers brought him in with the statement that they had come to make a complaint against a gang of blackmailers, but they wouldn't wear out a warrant for their arrest. They didn't do that because those blackmailers were Ward's friends. He was their pal. Ward's father made an investigation of it himself. Is it because he was found that his son was blackmailing him that he has run away from here? He has fled the state, possibly even the country, so that he couldn't be called upon to testify? Now, to clarify, we don't want to know the details of this secret. But don't you, the jury, want to know about that $30,000 and about the blackmail gang? Don't you want some proof about how these alleged blackmailers operated? Don't you want to see some of those terrible threatening letters he says they wrote? He simply says, "I've been blackmailed. You've got to take that as fact." If this had been going on for months, why didn't he produce the checks from his bank accounts? They could have shown something. Ward has his counsel fooled as he had the sheriff and district attorney fooled 16 months ago. And Mr. Mills has given a far-fetched explanation that can almost be seen as extreme coincidences. And they credit Ward's story. And not even a decorated justice such as Mr. Mills could explain the lack of powder burns on Peters' skin and clothing. It should be noted that Mr. Ward failed in everything that a real man should have done, or in this case, a loyal police commissioner. If his story is true in any particular, it was his duty to immediately notify the authorities and tell them the story. If he was innocent, he has nothing to fear. He wasn't even called upon to testify in his favor of his own character or to reiterate his own story, to defend himself. He should have insisted upon an immediate investigation, but instead of doing that, he went to his lawyers, caused the spurious statements to be prepared, and he and they withheld it until the newspapers took up the story, and they thought it best to make the explanation that they did. Now, Peter's mother does not want to see Walter Ward convicted if he is innocent of murder in the first degree. Mrs. Peters approached Governor Albert Smith this past January asking to reopen the case, not because she wanted vengeance, but because she wanted justice. Mr. Ward did admit to killing her son. Although he had been indicted multiple times, he had not been brought to a trial before a jury that might have passed on his guilt until this past month. I charge that Walter Ward killed an unarmed man and lied about it. In the view of the damaging evidence we have produced, I cannot ask you for anything else but a verdict of murder in the first degree.
I'm a great believer in personality. Now, is there anyone among you who believes that they're looking upon a cold-blooded murderer? I believe in a man facing his judges, and then I judge a man by the wife he has. I wanted you, gentlemen, to see the parents of a family together. I have a portrait of the children. Now, is this a man who would commit sexually degenerate practices? Is this a man who relies on tour affairs, gambling, and crime to get a thrill? Now, the prosecution has taken well-known facts concerning the father of my client and used them to, well, spin his own distorted tale. The prosecution is resorting to smoke and mirrors, camouflage, and false testimonies to attack Mr. Ward. The worst thing of all is that the prosecution called Mrs. Ward to testify against her husband. This woman sent by God himself. You see her face worn with suffering? Unskilled in law, she probably thought that the words on her lips were sealing his doom. Now, when the evidence received from Mr. Ward was, well, it was utterly inconsequential. It referred merely to what the hour he returned home on the night Clarence was shot. Information that Ward had already provided. Does the prosecution challenge her to a revelation of the family secret that has been at the heart of this entire scheme? The prosecution has only proven what we wanted to prove ourselves. That the paths of Ward and Peters never crossed until they met in Westchester County that night. Peters was a desperado who permitted himself to be hired shortly after his arrival in New York for blackmail, the meanest of crimes. And none of the evidence that has been brought forward during the trial has been able to discredit the fact that Ward felt that his life was in danger early on the morning of May 16th and took it into his own hands to defend his life and the lives of his family. I have faith in Westchester County. Well, I have faith in her sense of right. And I have faith in you. Now I leave this man in your keeping. Your judgment and your sense of decency that this man, this woman, and their children, that this persecution which has followed them for 16 months may be ended forever by your verdict of entire acquittal. Thank you, one and all.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it is your job to decide whether Walter Ward is guilty of murder in the first degree. If found guilty, Mr. Ward may be sentenced to life in prison. Jurors, please retire to the jury room to deliberate. We shall reconvene on September 29th at 10 a.m. to hear the verdict. Court is adjourned.
Eddie? Clarence? Clarence, what are you doing here? Here. Sweetheart, it's okay. Oh, look at me. I am so sorry. Well, after everything that I've said and everything that's happened, I'm sorry.
This dark and stormy night, faith beholds the feeble light. Up the blackness streaking, knowing God's own time is best. In a patient hope I rest, for a full day breaking.
Clarence, please. You have to tell me what happened that night. No, I know Ward lied. He refuses to tell the truth. Only you can, please. Just, please keep trying. I can almost hear you. No, we'll write it down. Just write it down. Okay. We'll talk about it. That- No, please, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep losing you over and over again, Clarence! Doris. Why are you up?
You were talking to Clarence again.
Was I? Well, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. Do you know where your father went?
No.
He's probably just on another walk. Yes, Doris?
It's hard to sleep. I'm really hungry.
I know. Me too. We'll eat in the morning, all right? Get off to bed.
Okay.
When the verdict is announced, there will be no demonstrations whatsoever. Keep your seats. Gentlemen of the jury, have you agreed upon a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
And do you find the defendant, Walter Ward, guilty or not guilty?
We find the defendant not guilty.
If your honor will allow, will I move the defendant's discharge?
The jury is thanked and excused. Court is hereby adjourned.
Well, the verdict of the jury is no more than what I expected, and I am not surprised. But if some poor boy had killed my son instead of a wealthy man, he would have been tried long ago. If I hadn't gone to New York and confronted Governor Smith after the first indictment was missed, the case would have been dropped. But I did so. I showed the people of New York that Ward could not escape trial. My husband and I hope that Ward is happy with his acquittal. I hear he jubilantly returned to work the next day, confident, happy, and seemingly consequence-free. But we are certain that his conscience will bother him. He will always know what he did.